She was just patching up a concrete wall. Could this overlooked civilian hold a deadly secret? No name tag, no rank, just another civilian tech in Pargo trousers. Quiet, overlooked, easy to ignore until one afternoon, a Navy SEAL handed her his rifle, didn't say a word, just backed away. And in that moment, the entire room stopped breathing, because the way she touched that weapon, the precision, the confidence, the silence, it wasn't learned from manuals. It was earned in places the rest of them didn't talk about. Want to know what made a room full of elite operators fall completely silent? What convinced them to trust her without a title, without a salute? Then hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Because this is one of those stories you'll be thinking about long after the sound fades. You know that smell that hits you when you walk into a serious shooting range? It's not just gunpowder, though there's plenty of that. It's the mix of hot metal, concrete, dust, and something else you can't quite place. Sweat, maybe, or just the weight of concentration hanging in the air like humidity. Bathed Me at the Naval Training Facility had that smell times 10. The long concrete corridor echoed with the sharp crack of rifles and the metallic ping of brass hitting the floor. SEALs moved through their drills with that particular kind of focus that comes from knowing your life might depend on muscle memory someday. Commands were barked, acknowledged, executed, everything precise, everything purposeful. And there, barely visible in the controlled chaos, was Isla Henning. She worked along the back wall, her gray t-shirt already showing sweat stains despite the early hour. Her canvas tool bag sat open beside her, revealing the kind of organized efficiency that spoke of years doing this work. The badge clipped to her cargo pants was simple enough: Facility Repair Level C. The kind of ID that made you invisible to people who had more important things to worry about, which suited Isla just fine. She'd been patching a section of damaged concrete for the better part of 2 hours, working with the methodical patience of someone who knew that half-assed repairs came back to bite you later. The wall had taken a beating from repeated concussion rounds, leaving spiderweb cracks that needed more than just a quick patch job. Her gloved hands moved steadily, spreading polymer compound in smooth, even strokes. The SEALs floating around her might as well have been looking through her. No eye contact, no acknowledgement. She was just part of the landscape, like the target mechanisms or the ventilation ducts. And honestly, that's how she preferred it. She learned long ago that being unremarkable was its own kind of superpower. But invisible didn't mean deaf. Over by the water station, a cluster of junior SEALs had planted themselves like they owned the place. One had the kind of patchy mustache that screamed trying too hard, and another kept fidgeting with a sidearm that clearly wasn't cooperating. Their conversation floated over the range noise, casual and dismissive. $20 says she used to be a gym teacher, one of them said, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant to be. Those arms definitely coach softball or something, his buddy added with a smirk. Isla kept her safety glasses on and her attention on the wall. She'd heard worse, and from better men than these, but she also knew the type. Young, eager to prove themselves, and absolutely convinced that being loud made them important. What they didn't know was that she'd been listening to conversations like this for more years than they'd been in the service. And what she'd learned was that the loudest ones usually had the most to prove. A sharp clang interrupted her thoughts. Someone had tossed a pistol onto the metal crate nearest her workstation. It hit crooked, the magazine partially ejected, the kind of casual disrespect for equipment that made her jaw tighten involuntarily. She didn't turn around, didn't give them the satisfaction, just kept working. Her trowel moved in steady, practiced arcs across the damaged concrete. Let them think what they wanted to plink. She had work to do. But as she smoothed the compound into the cracks, her eyes caught the reflection in her safety glasses. That pistol wasn't just carelessly dropped. It was actually damaged. The slide was catching, probably from someone who tried to force a jam clear instead of properly addressing it. The magazine well showed signs of stress too, like it had been reassembled by someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. She could fix it in about 3 minutes, but that wasn't her job. Not today anyway. The next morning brought the same routine. Hot air, loud voices, and the constant percussion of live fire practice. Isla arrived early as usual, coming through the maintenance entrance with her tool bag and a coffee that had gone cold during her commute. She'd learned that arriving before the official start time meant less questions and more peace to do her work properly. Today's project was the reset system in Bay 2, a mechanism that had been acting up for months. Everyone had gotten used to working around it, manually resetting targets or just avoiding that lane entirely, the kind of temporary solution that becomes permanent because nobody wants to deal with the hassle of actually fixing it. She'd been crawling around in the service access for about an hour when she heard familiar voices, the same group from yesterday, apparently making commentary on her work, a regular morning entertainment. "What's she doing now?" one of them asked. "Probably making it worse," another replied. "You want to bet she used to be a gym teacher?" "Those arms definitely coach softball or something," his buddy added with a smirk. Isla kept her safety glasses on and her attention on the wall. She'd heard worse and from better men than these, but she also knew the type. Young, eager to prove themselves, and absolutely convinced that being loud made them important. What they didn't know was that she'd been listening to conversations like this for more years than they'd been in the service, and what she'd learned was that the loudest ones usually had the most to prove. A sharp clang interrupted her thoughts. Someone had tossed a pistol onto the metal crate nearest her workstation. It hit crooked, the magazine partially ejected, the kind of casual disrespect for equipment that made her jaw tighten involuntarily. She didn't turn around, didn't give them the satisfaction, just kept working. Her trowel moved in steady, practiced arcs across the damaged concrete. Let them think what they wanted to think. She had work to do. But as she smoothed the compound into the cracks, her eyes caught the reflection in her safety glasses. That pistol wasn't just carelessly dropped. It was actually damaged. The slide was catching, probably from someone who tried to force a jam clear instead of properly addressing it. The magazine well showed signs of stress too, like it had been reassembled by someone who knew just enough to be dangerous. She could fix it in about 3 minutes, but that wasn't her job. Not today anyway. The next morning brought the same routine. Hot air, loud voices, and the constant percussion of live fire practice. Isla arrived early as usual, coming through the maintenance entrance with her tool bag and a coffee that had gone cold during her commute. She'd learned that arriving before the official start time meant less questions and more peace to do her work properly. Today's project was the reset system in Bay 2, a mechanism that had been acting up for months. Everyone had gotten used to working around it, manually resetting targets or just avoiding that lane entirely, the kind of temporary solution that becomes permanent because nobody wants to deal with the hassle of actually fixing it. She'd been crawling around in the service access for about an hour when she heard familiar voices, the same group from yesterday, apparently making commentary on her work, a regular morning entertainment. "What's she doing now?" one of them asked. "Probably making it worse," another replied.
"You want to bet she's here because somebody's cousin needed a favor?" They settled in to watch like they expected fireworks or failure, probably both. Could this quiet tech turn their skepticism into respect? Isla ignored them and focused on the problem at hand. The reset mechanism was more complex than it looked. A series of hydraulic pistons, steel cables, and electronic sensors that had to work in perfect coordination. One misaligned component could throw off the entire system. But she'd worked with worse. Her tool roll held equipment that wasn't standard issue. Custom torque drivers, precision files, measurement tools that most base maintenance wouldn't even know existed. She'd accumulated them over years of work that required more than just good enough. 20 minutes later, she triggered the test sequence. The system hummed to life, smooth as silk. Targets swept back and forth with the kind of fluid precision that made the range instructor stop mid-sentence and stare. For the first time in months, the reset worked exactly as designed. She packed up her tools with the same methodical care she'd used to unpack them, every piece in its designated spot, secured and ready for the next job. As she zipped up the roll, she caught sight of the two SEALs still watching her. Their expressions caught somewhere between surprise and annoyance. "Even a broken clock's right twice a day," one of them muttered. Isla stood up, dusted off her pants, and walked over to the crate where yesterday's pistol still sat. She didn't pick it up, not yet, but she ran one finger along the barrel, slow and deliberate, the way you'd examine a piece of machinery you understood intimately. Then she walked away without a word. But someone else had been watching the whole exchange. A petty officer leaning against the doorframe, chewing gum, and taking in the scene with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing something others weren't. He looked at the pistol, then at the space where Isla had disappeared, then back at the pistol. He didn't say anything, but he was definitely thinking.
The breakthrough came later that week when a SEAL fire team dragged themselves back from a training exercise that had clearly been as exhausting as it was filthy.
They dropped their gear with the weary efficiency of people who'd been pushing hard for hours, weapons clattering onto the armory tables. "This piece of junk nearly took my hand off," one of them complained, hefting an MK-18 that looked like it had seen better days. "Keeps locking up every time I try to clear it." The base gunsmith, a guy named Rodriguez, who had been doing this job longer than some of these SEALs had been alive, gave it a cursory look. "Carbon fouling, probably. You guys run these things harder than NASCAR engines." He cycled the action a few times, shrugged, and set it aside. "I'll strip it down later. Might be time to retire this one." But as the team filed out, one of them, a quiet operator everyone called Ghost, lingered behind. He'd been watching Hila work for days, noting the way she moved, the tools she used, the results she got. Unlike the younger guys, he'd been around long enough to recognize competence when he saw it. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, "before you scrap that rifle, maybe let the repair lady take a look." Rodriguez glanced over at Hila, who was working methodically, organizing her tools after finishing work on a ventilation intake. "Her? She fixes walls and air conditioning." Ghost picked up the MK-18, feeling the weight of it, the familiar balance that had saved his life more times than he could count. "Yeah, well, she also fixed the target system that 3 different techs couldn't figure out, and I heard Jack Rains let her work on his personal piece." Rodriguez's eyebrows went up. Everyone knew about Rains' pistol. No kidding. No kidding. Ghost set the rifle down carefully. "What's the worst that could happen? It's headed for the scrap heap anyway." Hila was working about 20 feet away, fixing a crack in the blast shield that nobody else had even noticed. She didn't look up, didn't comment, but her peripheral vision caught the way the bolt was sticking, the discoloration around the gas port, the slight gap in the upper receiver that shouldn't have been there. The team cleared out, taking their exhaustion and their stories with them. The afternoon shift came and went. Eventually, the range settled into the quiet hum of after-hours maintenance, just the ventilation system and the occasional ping of cooling metal. That's when Hila approached the abandoned rifle. She picked it up like she was greeting an old friend, her hands automatically finding the balance point, the wear patterns, the small details that told the story of how it had been used and abused. This wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. The disassembly was surgical, not the hurried field stripping of someone trying to get through a checklist, but the methodical breakdown of someone who understood each component's purpose and relationship to the others. She laid out the parts with the kind of organization that spoke of muscle memory, each piece in its logical place. The problem was obvious once you knew what to look for. The bolt cam pin had been wearing unevenly, causing the whole bolt carrier group to bind under stress. A simple fix if you had the right tools and the knowledge to use them, which, as it turned out, she did. Her tool roll produced instruments that definitely weren't in the standard maintenance kit. Precision files, custom reamers, measurement tools that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She worked with the quiet concentration of someone who'd done this thousands of times before, making adjustments measured in thousandths of an inch. But she wasn't alone. Ghost had been watching from the doorway, remembering another time, another place, when he'd seen work like this. Afghanistan, 2019. A fire base in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hostiles, and their primary weapons were failing one by one. Then someone had shown up. No name, no unit patch, just black fatigues and a tool roll that looked exactly like the one Hila was using now. That operator had disappeared before dawn, leaving behind weapons that ran smoother than factory spec.
The only trace was a small mark scratched into each bolt carrier, a tiny geometric pattern that looked like random scratches unless you knew what to look for. Ghost stepped closer, his movement quiet as his call sign suggested. When Hila held up the bolt carrier to examine it in the light, he saw what he'd been looking for. There, etched into the metal with tool marks so fine they were almost invisible, was the same geometric pattern he'd seen in Afghanistan. His breath caught. Hila sensed his presence and turned, bolt carrier still in her hands. Their eyes met, and in that moment, recognition passed between them. Not the kind that came from shared experiences, but the kind that came from shared understanding. She'd seen that look before, in mirrors, in the faces of people who'd been places that didn't exist and done things that never happened. "You've got good hands," Ghost said quietly. "So do you," she replied, noting the way he stood and the way he moved, the small scars on his knuckles that came from very specific kinds of work. He nodded toward the bolt carrier. "That's beautiful work. Clean, precise." "It's just maintenance," she said, but there was something in her voice that suggested they both knew better. "Yeah," Ghost said, backing away, "just maintenance." But as he left, he made a point of walking past the junior SEALs who were still hanging around the water cooler, making their jokes and their assumptions. "You boys might want to show a little more respect," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of being the guy other people relied on. "That lady's forgotten more about weapons than you'll ever know." One of them, the one with the patchy mustache, started to smirk. "Come on, Ghost, she's just what?" Ghost's tone could have cut glass. "Go ahead, finish that sentence." The kid's mouth snapped shut. "That's what I thought." Ghost's eyes swept the group. "You want some advice? Start treating her like she belongs here, because she does." That's when Jack Rains walked in. Petty Officer First Class Rains had been around long enough to know the difference between someone who knew what they were doing and someone who was just pretending. He'd also been around long enough to know that the best operators were often the ones who didn't need to announce their credentials. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching her work. No challenge, no interruption, just professional interest in professional work. When she finally looked up, they locked eyes for a moment. No words exchanged, but a whole conversation happened in that silence. Recognition, maybe? Or just the acknowledgement of competence. Then Rains did something that surprised even him. He reached over his shoulder and unslung his personal sidearm. This wasn't just any pistol. It was a custom piece that had been modified by exactly 3 people in the entire country. People who charged more for trigger work than most folks made in a month. It was the kind of weapon that nobody touched without explicit permission. He set it on the workbench beside her and stepped back. The room went quiet. Even the ventilation system seemed to hold its breath. A couple of other personnel had noticed what was happening. "Is he serious?" One of them whispered. "Nobody touches that gun." But Isla didn't hesitate. She set down the MK-18, adjusted her gloves, and picked up Rains's pistol with the same careful attention she'd given the rifle. Her hands moved over it like she was reading Braille, finding the wear patterns, the modifications, the tiny imperfections that accumulated over thousands of rounds. She found the problem almost immediately. A hairline misalignment in the bolt catch that was causing microscopic binding, the kind of issue that would take most gunsmiths hours to diagnose, if they caught it at all. The fix took about 30 seconds, a tool the size of a toothpick, a few precise movements, and the pistol was running smoother than it had since the day it was built. She slid it back across the bench without a word. He picked it up, checked the action, and nodded once. Not the grudging acknowledgement of someone who'd been proven wrong, but the professional respect of someone who recognized mastery when they saw it. Then Rains walked away, leaving Isla alone with the MK-18 and a room full of questions nobody was brave enough to ask. Word spread the way it always does in military communities, quietly through unofficial channels and conversations that happened between the lines of official business. By morning, people were talking about the woman who'd fixed Rains' pistol. Not loudly, not openly, but with the kind of respectful curiosity reserved for people who'd earned it. "She's not just maintenance," someone said.
"Did you see how she handled that bolt group?" another added. "Rains didn't even blink like he expected it." The stories found their way to Staff Sergeant Aaron Daniels, the base's senior armorer, and a man who didn't appreciate being shown up in his own workshop. He had been doing this job for 15 years, and he'd never seen anyone work with that kind of precision. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He looked up her file. What he found made him sit back in his chair and stare at the screen. Isla Henning's personnel record was thin, suspiciously thin. No boot camp, no traditional MOS, no obvious career progression, but her security clearance was 3 levels above his own, and her previous assignments were either classified or simply didn't exist in any database he had access to. Most telling was a single line in her work history. SOTB, do not contact. Daniels had been around long enough to know what that meant. Special Operations Team Black, a designation that officially didn't exist for operations that officially never happened. The kind of unit that left no footprints and took no credit. But before he could process that information fully, his computer chimed with an incoming message. Classified eyes only. He opened it and felt his blood run cold. Wurjik T. Daniels, you are hereby directed to cease all inquiries regarding contractor L. Henning. Any further attempts to access classified records will result in immediate review of your security clearance and possible disciplinary action. This directive comes from the highest levels of command and is non-negotiable. Acknowledge receipt immediately. Command authority. Daniel stared at the message, his hands trembling slightly. In 15 years of military service, he'd never seen anything like this. Not even for actual classified operations. This was the kind of message that meant someone very powerful was very serious about keeping secrets. He typed back a quick acknowledgement, then deleted the message per protocol. But as he sat there in the quiet of his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that he just glimpsed something far bigger than a simple contractor assignment. Meanwhile, across the base, Senior Chief Rivera was having his own moment of recognition. He'd been walking past the range when he'd seen something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Isla was working on a rifle scope, but it wasn't the work that caught his attention. It was the way she moved her hands. Specific gestures, precise finger positions, the kind of muscle memory that came from years of specialized training. He'd seen those exact movements before. In a briefing room in Virginia, watching an instructor demonstrate advanced optic calibration for a mission that never made it into any official records. The instructor had been a small, quiet woman who'd introduced herself only as Sam and had proceeded to show them techniques that weren't in any manual. Rivera had never forgotten those hand movements because they'd saved his life 2 weeks later in a place he wasn't supposed to be. Now, he was watching those same movements performed by a woman who was supposed to be fixing air conditioning and patching walls. He approached slowly, respectfully, the way you'd approach someone you suspected of being far more dangerous than they appeared. "Excuse me, miss," he said quietly. Isla looked up, her hands never stopping their precise work on the scope. "I was wondering," Rivera continued, "if you might know anything about long-range optics calibration, specifically the kind of work that requires specialized training." For a moment, Isla's hands did stop. She looked at him directly, and he saw something in her eyes that confirmed his suspicions. "I know a little about optics," she said carefully. Rivera nodded. "I thought you might. Would you mind if I asked where you learned?" "Here and there," she replied, but there was a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You pick things up." "I'm sure you do." Rivera glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "If I don't mind me saying, you have very good hands. Very professional." "Thank you," Isla said simply. "So do you." They understood each other perfectly. He picked up the phone and called the base commander. "Sir, I've got a question about one of our contractors, Isla Henning. Her clearance level seems—" "Stop." The commander's voice was sharp. "She's on a need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know." The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, then back at the screen. He'd seen buried records before, but never for someone whose official job description was fixing walls and equipment. Across the base, Senior Chief Rivera was having his own moment of recognition. He'd heard about the pistol incident, and something about it had been bothering him. Not the technical skill. He'd seen plenty of talented armorers over the years, but the way Rains had handled it, the quiet confidence, the lack of surprise, like he'd known what would happen. Rivera had encountered the SOTB designation once before, years ago, in a theater he wasn't supposed to talk about. Equipment had shown up with that tag, pre-configured and perfectly tuned. The operator who delivered it had said only, "Black Team sends their regards." Now, there was a woman on his base wearing cargo pants and a maintenance badge who apparently had the same lineage.
He found Daniels in the armory that evening, still staring at Henning's file. "You ever seen anyone else touch Rain's personal weapon?" Rivera asked. "Never," Daniels replied immediately. "He'd rather eat glass." Rivera nodded slowly. "So either we're looking at a serious breach of protocol, or someone who used to be one of us," Daniels finished. They stood in comfortable silence, two professionals trying to make sense of an anomaly in their ordered world. "She doesn't ask questions," Daniel said finally. "Doesn't need supervision, just shows up, fixes things, and leaves. Everything she touches works better than it did before." Rivera glanced toward the door where Isla had passed by earlier, her tool bag slung over her shoulder like she was carrying the weight of the world. "Maybe that's all we need to know." "You think she's still active?" Rivera considered the question. "I think she never really stopped." Over the next few days, something shifted in the ecosystem of the range. It wasn't traumatic. Military culture doesn't change overnight, but it was noticeable to anyone paying attention. Weapons started appearing near Isla's workspace, not obviously, not with fanfare, but with the kind of casual placement that suggested trust. A rifle that pulled to the left, a pistol with a trigger that felt mushy, a scope that wouldn't hold zero. No requests, no work orders, just quiet faith that problems would be solved. And they were. Isla maintained her routine. Same gray t-shirt, same methodical approach, same professional invisibility. But now even the base working dog seemed to recognize her as belonging. The Belgian Malinois that usually treated strangers like potential threats would simply watch her pass, alert but relaxed. The younger SEALs took longer to adjust. One corporal asked a sergeant if Henning had connections upstairs. Another wondered out loud if she was somebody's sister. That one got reassigned to perimeter duty in the swampiest corner of the base, where the mosquitoes were the size of small aircraft and the humidity could melt steel. But nobody speculated after that. The real test came on a Tuesday afternoon when Rains walked into the bay with his entire team. They were 72 hours out from deployment, running final checks on equipment that needed to be perfect, because second chances weren't part of the job description. Rains approached Isla's workstation with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested official business. His MK-17 was slung across his chest, and from the expression on his face, it wasn't cooperating. "Won't group past 200 meters," he said without preamble. "Deployment's Thursday." The team remained the respectful distance back, but their attention was focused. This wasn't just another repair job. This was mission-critical equipment for people whose lives depended on precision. Isla looked up from the scope mount she'd been adjusting, saw the team, understood the stakes. Rains didn't hand her the rifle. Instead, he laid it carefully on the reinforced work surface she'd welded herself, treating it with the respect due to a precision instrument. That's when she noticed the new addition to her workspace. Someone had installed a proper weapons rack, padded supports, lined trays, non-reflective finish, the kind of setup that cost serious money and suggested serious intent. Above it, a small bronze plaque caught the light. "Let her handle it." No signature, no unit designation, no official authorization. But the message was clear enough. Isla looked back at Rains, who gave her a single nod. Not a request, not a command, but professional acknowledgement between equals. She picked up the MK-17 and began her diagnostic. The team waited, patient as statues, while she worked through the rifle systems with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of absolute competence. The problem was subtle, a slight misalignment in the barrel extension that was causing point-of-impact shift under stress, the kind of issue that would take most armorers hours to identify and days to fix properly. It took her 45 minutes. When she handed the rifle back, Rains checked the action, shouldered it, and dry-fired at a target across the bay. Whatever he saw on the scope made him smile. The first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Outstanding," he said simply. The team deployed on schedule. Isla never asked where they were going, never said goodbye, never expected updates. That wasn't her job. Her job was making sure the equipment worked when it needed to work. Everything else was someone else's responsibility. But as she cleaned up her workspace that evening, she found 4 more rifles waiting for her attention. Each tagged not with names or units, but with a kind of quiet trust that couldn't be ordered or demanded. It had to be earned. She adjusted her gloves, selected her tools, and got back to work. The wall she'd patched on her first day was holding strong. The target system was running smoothly, and the range was full of people training for missions they might not come back from. Somewhere in the controlled chaos of military preparation, a woman in cargo pants and a maintenance badge was making sure that when the moment came, the equipment would be ready.
because that's what she'd always done. Before the clearances, before the classifications, before they gave her a number and told her to disappear, she'd made the tools that made the difference. And in a world where the smallest detail could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home, that was the most important job of all. The mission hadn't ended. It had just gotten quieter. But the work continued. One rifle at a time, one repair at a time, one moment of perfection at a time. Because some things never changed. And sometimes, that was exactly what was needed.